Good evening. Welcome once again to the Bible Speaks today from LBC TV Ministries. Before we get into the program, let me mention a couple of things. If you watch us on a regular basis, you will see that we've been a bit all over the place as far as a logical series of recordings. That's been due to some, let's say, some library technical troubles we had here. And so a couple of our programs have played more than once. And in fact, last week we had to replay the previous week's one because we didn't have a program ready. And that's due a lot to staff shortages with sickness and this sort of thing. I don't do this on my own, as I've mentioned so many times before. There's a whole slew of people behind the glass in there, and when there's not a whole slew of people, it's sometimes difficult to get things going. And of course, I've been a bit remiss because I've been out of town a couple of weeks, a couple of times in weeks when we need to record. So hopefully that's a little bit behind us now, and we can pick up the pace and get onto a more regular footing. For those of you who watch regularly, you're going to say, oh, I've heard this before when I start getting into the program, and you're absolutely right, because I'm going to go back and recap the first program we did on the Jebusites a month and a half ago. And the reason for that is we stopped and went into some depth into the land of Canaan itself to try and give you some background to where all these people were and where they came from. And before we started going into talking about the individual people. So in case you might have forgotten, I'm going to quickly go back and recap on what I did before, and then we'll carry on with the rest of the program. You may ask, well, why are we talking about these various people, the Jebusites or the Hittites or whoever, whatever. And I think it's important to realize that all of these people contributed in some form or another to the Hebrew Bible and in some cases the New Testament as we know it, because people bring with them things and customs and things that they've learnt or picked up from their forebears or from their ancestors. And so some of the things that we will talk about in this program, you will see come from, although they're from the early part of the Old Testament, they carry all the way through, because the people who have these customs or ideas or worship these gods are still around in the area. It's not quite the way it seems to be if you just take the Bible and don't look at the surrounding parts to it. I mean, let's take the Jebusites, for example. The current thinking used to be that the Jebusites were the people who lived in Jerusalem, and yeah and no. As we're going to see tonight and tomorrow and next week, you will see that it ain't necessarily so, as it says in the Porgy and Bess. I mean, according to the Hebrew Bible, when I refer to the Hebrew Bible, I'm talking about the Old Testament, all right? Just a simple way of doing it. According to the Hebrew Bible, the Jebusites were a Canaanite tribe, okay? They weren't... Remember we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. When you talk about the Canaanites, that's a whole country full of people divided into different tribal groups. That's what people get confused. People talk about the Canaanites. Well, the Canaanites were there was no such thing as I'll go back. You could be a Canaanite. It's like you could be a Kentuckian, but you came from Covington or from somewhere else. In other words, the land of Canaan was inhabited by Canaanites, who in turn were part of different tribal groups, like the Jebusites, the Hittites, the Hittites, and everybody else. So and sometimes the Bible uses generic terms to describe the whole country, and sometimes it uses individual tribal terms. So according to the Hebrew Bible, the Jebusites were a Canaanite tribe, okay, who lived around and built the city of Jerusalem, okay, before King David conquered it. So it was a city, fairly well-known city, before King David came on the scene. I mean, the book of Kings states quite emphatically that Jerusalem was known as Jebus, okay, prior to David conquering it. Jebus, okay? Jebusites, obviously the connection was there and everybody clung to it, okay? According to some of the Bible chronologies, and here's where we get into those little difficult situations where you get two different stories, two different time frames. But according to some Bible chronologies, they say the city was conquered by King David in 1003 BC, okay, or BCE if you like. Or if you look at some of the other sources, 869 BC. Okay, well, you think, well, that's not a big deal. Yeah, it's 200 years odd. So it is a big deal. It's a long period of time. Think what's happened in this country in 200 years. So lots of things can happen. So we don't really know exactly when David conquered the city. We got lots of stories about how he did it, but not how he did it. And as I said, the identification of Jebus with Jerusalem has been disputed, I think, by scholars for a great many years. Every non-biblical mention of Jerusalem that we found in the ancient Near East, from the archaeology and the tablets and the records that we've dug up, okay, every single one of the non-biblical accounts refer to the city as Jerusalem, not Jebus. So it would seem that the term Jerusalem for the city had been there a lot longer than at first we thought. I mean, you remember, last year, middle of last year sometime, we were talking about the Amarna letters, which is that in about 14th century BC, this was the tablets with the communication between Egypt and the governor of what was the Canaanite area in those days, with all the details and everything about who did what to whom and everything, and it's a great source of our information. But even the Amarna letters, which were written, as I said, by the chieftain of Jerusalem, and it's called Jerusalem, Abdi Heba, and they called Jerusalem Jerusalem, U-R-S-A-L-I-M, Jerusalem, okay? And also in the same letters, collection letters, it's called Beth Salem, which is the house of Salem. You are aware, and we've talked about this in other programs, but the prefix Beth it means the house, and then afterwards like Bethlehem is the house of him. Okay, fine. The Akkadian name, remember the Akkadians way back, early part of history, the Akkadian name for Jerusalem was Jerusalem. So, it seems like the name's been out there one time, which actually means foundation or the base of the god Salim. So these names sort of come out at you from history. As a matter of interest, the first part of that comes from a Hebrew Semitic word, which means like putting a cornerstone in. This building's dedicated to, and the last part, the Canaanite god of the setting sun. So who knows? Anyway, there is no evidence, and this is what gets interesting. There's no evidence of Jebus, a town called Jebus, or even Jebusites, in other words, people from that town, outside of the Old Testament. And some scholars have even gone so far as to say that perhaps Jebus was a different place altogether from Jerusalem. Again, whenever you've got one opinion, you've got another. Some scholars prefer to see the name Jebus as a kind of an ethnic name without any particular background to it, just a local nickname, if you will. There's a reference to Jebus on a contract tablet that dates from 2200 BC. Okay, so that it seems that the only place where you can get a reference to the Jebusites, clear and simple, is from the Hebrew Bible, and it's the only place that I know of, that I've read about or could find any research on, and believe me, it got me interested. I did a lot of research. It's the only surviving ancient text that's known to use the term Jebusite to describe the pre-Israelite inhabitants of Jerusalem. I mean, according to the Table of Nations, if you read Genesis 10, if you read Genesis 10, there's this listing of, it's called the Table of Nations, who everybody was, and the Jebusites are identified as a Canaanite tribe. Okay, we go along with that, which is listed in third place among the Canaanite groups, between the Hittites and the Amorites. Okay, and before we had, when I say modern archaeology, I'm talking about within the late 19th, 20th century archaeology. Before that, most biblical scholars of all the different books I've read, and there's some amazing books, they're not in German, they're translated into English, but there's some amazing Bible research done by the Germans in the late 19th century, which makes some fascinating reading, because, you know, it's methodical, and it really goes to town to try and doesn't have wild-eyed theories. Just the facts, ma'am, if you know what I mean. But those scholars held the view that the Jebusites were identical to the Hittites, and we know the Hittites have been there a long time. They were one of the early. You'll remember a few weeks ago talking about the Hittites being this group, or this nation that came from what we now call Turkey, and was one of the big three in that area way back in 2000 BC. But the popular view now is that the Jebusites were most likely an Amorite tribe. So here we have the list of nations in Genesis 10, which talks about the tribes, and it says, oh, there's the Amorites, the Hittites, and now the Jebusites. And now the scholars are saying, yeah, but the Jebusites were really part of the Amorites, not part of the Hittites. And he identified with the reasons he gave for that were that there's a reference to, let me get this right, Jebusium. There's reference to Jebusium in a letter found in some archives in Syria, in a town called Mari. And it's true, really, if you go back, true and confusing, that if you go back and start looking at all this old research, that more than one clan or tribe had similar names, and the Jebusites and the Jebusium might be two different tribes indeed, or not, as the case may be. But they may have been separate people. That's why in the Amarna letter they're mentioned in two different times. But in the Amarna letters too, it's mentioned that the king of Jerusalem, so the head of king, was named Abdi Heba, which is a name. It gets really complicated here, bear with me. It's a name which invokes a Hurrian mother goddess named Hebat. Now the Hurrians was another tribe, more of them later, but was another group in that Canaanite grouping. And so it implied, if you like, that the Jebusites were Hurrians, I don't know, or at least were heavily influenced by that culture, okay? And the interesting thing is the last Jebusite king of Jerusalem, before David's conquering, was a chap called Oman, but his name was based on a Hurrian honorific, like Lord or Master or something like that. In the Bible's, in the conquest narrative of the Hebrew Bible, Piram, the king of Jarmuth, and Hoham, the king of Hebron, that's in Joshua, by the way, and they'd mentioned Shishai and Talmor, sons of Anak, and that sort of thing. They were all Hurrian-based names. And really, that's how you find out kind of who people are, by what they're called. I have an Anglo-Saxon name, and so people say, oh, he's English or Saxon, heritage. And if somebody has a Hispanic name, then they say, oh, there must be Hispanic heritage. I'm not talking about, by marriage and that sort of thing, but I mean, family names, okay? I mean, Melchizedek, mentioned in the Bible, you remember him? It's that passage that nobody understands very clearly. We must do a program on that one day. But when they talk about Melchizedek, they talk about Jerusalem being referred to as Salem, okay, rather than Jebus, of course, in passages in Genesis that describe him. According to Genesis, the ruler of Salem at the time of Abraham, going really back in the beginning, was Melchizedek. And as well as being a ruler, he was a priest, not an unknown thing in those days. Quite often, the leader of a tribe was not just their leader, but their priest. In fact, if you go back to the Israelites, or come forward in time to the Israelites, Moses was the leader of the Israelites, but he was also the top religious person, wasn't he? And in fact, throughout the Israelite history, they've gone between kings and priests as far as leaders go. Okay, I'm trying to get through this quickly, but to catch up from where we were. But the scholars, I say scholars, I use that term glibly, but I mean when I do my research, most of the people I glean the information from are indeed Bible scholars or Bible professors and things like that. Some are not. Some are lay people who've written a commentary, or sometimes I get a lot of information from reading the commentaries people have put in on a Bible professor or something who's put out a theory or something like that. Some of the answers and the comments you get back bring more light onto the subject than the actual document itself. Okay? Scholars, as I say, are uncertain whether Melchizedek was intended to be a Jebusite in the Genesis account, or whether they just lumped him in with that. There's no sort of rhyme or reason. But if he was in charge of Jerusalem, he was likely to be partly king, partly priest, and there was a sanctuary there dedicated to Zedek. Scholars even suspect that the Temple of Solomon was simply another evolution, if you will, where they took the site of the old Temple of Zedek and built the Solomon Temple on it. Okay. I mean, you remember Aruna? Of course you do. Yeah, everybody remembers Aruna. Right. Well, in case you didn't, he's another Jebusite who was referred to as Ornan by the books of Chronicles. Okay? And it's described by the books of Samuel as having sold his threshing floor to King David, where King David constructed an altar on that site, and that altar became the Temple of Solomon. So again, two different sort of theories on it. It's just, I hesitate to go into this too deep because, it's not the purpose of the program. But there is a great deal of controversy about just exactly who ruled and who ran Jerusalem prior to the Israelites taking it over. I mean, elsewhere in the Bible, it's kind of interesting, the Jebusites are described in a way, if you like, that suggests they worship the same God, El or Elion, as the Israelites, the one God. Whether nobody's quite proved to me, not convincingly anyway, that is in fact the case. But it's an interesting idea. Here's the Israelites coming in with their one God, only to find out that these people over here have the same sort of theory. I don't know. In Exodus, if you go back to Exodus, the good and large land flowing with milk and honey, you'll remember that statement, which was promised to Moses as the future home of the oppressed Hebrew people, included the land of the Jebusites. According to Joshua, Adonizedek led a confederation of Jebusites and tribes from the neighboring cities of Eglon and Jarmuth and a couple of others against Joshua, but was soundly defeated and killed. However, in Joshua 15, a bit later on, it states that Judah couldn't dislodge the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. Why do I know that? Because it states specifically in verse 63 that to this day the Jebusites live there with the people of Judah. And that brings me to another point that I've made a comment on in all these programs, is that if you read the Bible, it tells you that the Israelites went in and were commanded by God to slaughter everybody in the land and take it over. And we know that didn't happen. Probably because it wasn't possible to do that, literally, size for size. There weren't enough of them. Secondly, throughout the Old Testament, we get these references, like this one, that says references to so-and-so the Hittite, or so-and-so the Kittite, or so-and-so the Amorite. And in this particular case, there were still Jebusites living in the town with Judah. So it's fairly obvious that the Israelites moved off the desert into the country, and yes, and they fought battles and killed lots of people, I'm sure. But in fact, what they did was gradually absorbed all these other people. Judges 1. This is really obscure verse. I hadn't read this one. I mean, I've probably read it and not knew what it meant. Judges 21 portrays the Jebusites as continuing to dwell at Jerusalem within the territory that was otherwise occupied by the tribe of Benjamin. Remember, Benjamin got that little bit down the bottom? Okay? Some modern archaeologists, and you can see how confusing this can get sometimes, they now put forward a theory, and everyone's got a theory, right, that the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites under Joshua didn't happen quite that way, and that the Israelites actually originated as a subculture in the Canaanite society. Now, before you gasp and say, oh, tar and feather him, throw him out of town, remember what I said a little earlier, that there's some references to the Jebusites having some form of one God worship, El, before the Israelites got there. So I imagine these scholars have taken that as an idea that, oh, that's where it came off. I don't subscribe to that belief, and I'm not sure that not many other people do, but it's out there. Those same scholars believe that the accounts in the book of Joshua, of the battles and all that good stuff, are cobbled together from folk memory of disconnected battles that don't have anything to do with anything, just folk memory, with numerous different aggressors, which occurred over a time period of about 200 years. Again, I don't subscribe to that particular view, but it's out there. According to the books of Samuel that we do have, the Jebusites still had control of Jerusalem at the time of King David. But David wanted to take control of the city. Well, obviously the Jebusites weren't terribly thrilled about that, and they contested him, all right? And since Jebus was the largest fortress in Canaan, there's records going out there where they gloated that even the blind and the lame could withstand David's siege. There's another translation which is just as valid, I suppose, of the Jebusites, is that they said David would have to defeat the blind and the lame before anyone else. According to the version of the story in the Hebrew Bible, David managed to conquer the city in a surprise attack led by Joab. We all know that one, through the water supply tunnels. Now, Jerusalem had no natural water supply except for the Gihon Spring, and ever since its discovery in the 19th century, the shaft, which is called Warren Shaft, part of a system which connects the springs to the city, has been cited as evidence or plausibility that that's where the line of attack actually came. However, at the beginning of this century, they discovered a set of very heavy fortifications, including towers around the base of that shaft, which meant it was a bit unlikely as the attack would come that way, because it was heavily fortified. And if you think about it, why wouldn't it be? If you've got a tunnel leading into the city from the spring, anyone but an idiot would think, hey, they could come in that way, we better guard it. So, it would be David's, may have happened that way, but David would have to put up a pretty good fight to get through that. The Septuagint actually says in one translation that the Israelites had to attack the Jebusites with their daggers rather than go through the water shaft. So, who knows? Maybe they just did an onslaught, more numbers than that, and defeated it that way. The point is that there's a lot of different ideas put forward about some of the accounts in the Hebrew Bible about how things actually happened and when they actually happened and who did what to whom. That doesn't mean to say that the Bible is necessarily wrong, it's just that there are other opinions. Okay? Anyway, we're running out of time, so I'll leave it for now. We'll pick it up next week and finish off this kind of interesting account. If you think of this was everyday stuff to the people of the Old Testament. They lived it, and we should understand it better, right? So keep your Bibles handy, okay? For me, Tony Baxter, good night.